What is redemption? What does it really mean to a man like Jimmy O'Neill? Well, that's the question that's on Pamela Burns' mind as she comes face to face with Jimmy for the very first time. Is he really remorseful for killing those 4 men? Or is he just playing some kind of angle to make his time a little bit easier? That's what we're going to get into today on this episode of The Shoeshine Boys. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Shoeshine Boys. So today we're going to be reviewing Chapter 5. The current working title is called Redemption Doesn't Live Here. Now again, if this is one of your first times here, I highly recommend you go down and you click on the playlist, start from chapter number 1. That way you'll be up to date, go through all the different chapters. That way you're not having any gaps and trying to figure out why is he talking about this, that, or the other. Also too, if you'd like to read the entire book, The Shoeshine Boys, click the download PDF. You'll get the entire version before anybody else does, before it's even published. Anyway, let's just jump right in because we got a lot to cover today. So today's Chapter 5. The working title, as I mentioned, is called Redemption Doesn't Live Here. And that's very significant, and you're going to find out why as the chapter kind of unfolds, I suppose. But it starts out showing Pamela Burns. Now, you'll remember Pamela Burns. She's the journalist for previous chapters. Works for the Chicago Tribune, and she's working on a series about prisoners and redemption behind bars specifically. And she's there to meet Jimmy. She wants to see if he's a good fit to include in her series. She's already met with the warden. He speaks very highly of Jimmy and all the things that he's accomplished, but she wants to see for herself. As she sits in the interview room, she starts to review her notes. She's already met with 2 other potential inmates from different prisons. Primarily, what did she talk? One who is basically a man who basically found God, God after killing a teenager in a drink driving incident. So she's already met with him a few times. She thinks that he truly is seeking redemption and he'd be a good fit. So he's going to be number 1. The second is a drug addict, a woman who primarily has started up a drug rehabilitation program from behind bars. She's serving a life sentence for primarily killing her infant while she was high on drugs. If you remember from earlier when Pamela met with the warden, there's 2 main conditions, or a few main conditions primarily for anybody to be considered who's going to be in the series of articles. First, they have to be at least 10 years into a life sentence. They have to be in there for a violent act, and they have to be serving a life sentence. So the other 2, even it's violent. She killed her infant son. The other one was drinking and driving, killed a teenage boy. So they fit. They're both 10 years into their sentence, and they are truly trying to make the most of their time, and they are really trying to, I guess, atone for the acts of the past. But she's more curious now about Jimmy. Is he really seeking redemption? Does he fit the profile? She's not convinced. She's done her research. There's a big question mark over Jimmy. Yes, he's fascinating. He's definitely a very interesting subject, and she would love to know more about him. But does he really fit this series on redemption? That's what she's there today, to get inside his mind and see if he truly is seeking redemption, or is it just playing an angle primarily, maybe make his time a little bit easier behind bars. So, before we continue, I just want to ask a quick favor. Please do me a big favor, like, subscribe, comment. It really helps me out a lot here with the channel. Again, I'm trying to make this a collaboration. I want to know what you like and what you don't like. I'm trying to create the best story that I possibly can, best novel that I possibly can, and I'm counting on you to help me with that. So again, just do me a big favor, please. Like, comment, and subscribe. That way you don't miss anything either. Hit that notification button. Anyway, back to the chapter. So Pamela's in the waiting room, and primarily the interview room, and she can hear Jimmy coming. She can hear the door opening on the outside. She can see him actually entering into the room. And this is the first time she's ever actually seen Jimmy. She's seen pictures of him, but the last time she's seen pictures of him from the different articles and that when she was doing her research. That was 14, 15 years ago. He's a lot older now. He's early 40s. Still very recognizable, but he's after doing 14 hard years in prison. He's got a little bit of gray. He's still, he's still a good-looking guy. He's very calm. He had a very strong sense about him, composure, very unreadable, I suppose. But he comes in, and she sizes him up, and he doesn't react. But he takes his seat. The guard actually talks to Pamela, says, I'll be right outside the door if you need anything at all. And she says, thank you very much. He excuses himself. So for the first couple moments, the two are just sitting in silence, kind of sizing each other up. She finally goes and she breaks the silence. And she thanks him for coming, and she explains to him, that she wants to talk to him about the series on redemption, and she explains, and Jimmy politely interrupts her, and he tells her, "No, I understand. I know why you're here. I've already talked to the warden." And Pamela says, "Well, he seems to think you'd be a very good candidate for the series." And Jimmy makes a little crack, says, "Yeah, he wants me to be the poster boy, I suppose, for Deerfield Correctional." And she says, "Well, what do you think? Do you think you'd be a good candidate for my series on redemption?" And Jimmy says to her, "Well, I suppose that's your definition. Depends on your definition of what redemption is." And she says, "Well, on paper, it appears to be somebody exactly like you." And she starts to go through her notes, and she talks about how you've been here 14 years. You've never had any write-ups, never any trouble or anything like that. Since you've been here, you've gone back to school. You've gotten your MBA. You've started out a program for some of the other inmates, teaching them, I suppose, about how to go and start up a small business when they get out, so they can, I suppose, get back into society, become productive members of society again. Doing your best to help. It seems to me like you're really committed to making a difference, making the most of your time. Some might even refer to it as selfless. And Jimmy just kind of shrugs it off, and he says, "Well, look, yeah, I appreciate that, but look, I get something out of this too. I suppose it keeps me occupied. That's the one thing you don't want to be doing inside this place. It's just sitting in the cell inside your own head. I suppose it gives me a sense of purpose. It gives me something to be doing." And he says, I need that to stay focused. So she says, basically, I understand that. But she goes on, she said, "Well, look, Jimmy, I've done my research. I know who you are, primarily before the incident that brought you here. Well, you were very successful. You owned a number of different businesses. You had no convictions, no arrests, no nothing that would indicate that primarily you would be sitting in front of me right now." She goes, "There was a lot of rumors as far as your involvement with a organized crime gang called the Shoeshine Boys. Some would even speculate and say that you were actually the leader of that crew. But again, no evidence, nothing, no documentation that I can find that would support that's actually fact." And she said, then one day, out of the blue, you decide to just walk into a bar, pull out a gun, and kill 4 high-ranking members of a rival gang. And Jimmy Wright, again, as soon as he hears that word, a rival gang, or that phrase, I suppose, he kind of shifts, he changes, he tenses up. And he says, is that what you think? Is that what other people are saying about this out there? They were a rival gang? Do I look like the type of guy, or do I seem like the type of guy who is fighting over street corners, or turf, or some drug trade? He says, I had nothing to do with any of that. And then he kind of composes himself, gets the grip, gets control over his emotions. And he says, but what do I care? Let people think whatever they want to think. And she says, well, I want to know, Jimmy. Primarily, I want to get to know you. I want to know, who you are, what brought you here. And I want to see if you're, you fit the profile. Are you truly seeking redemption? And she says, what would make a man like you go ahead and, just give up everything? And she's tempted in her own mind to push him a little bit and just ask him flat out, does this have anything to do with the 4 men who were murdered the night before, the Shoeshine boys in that warehouse? But she catches herself. She decides that she needs to build up trust, that she doesn't want to push too hard too soon. So she just pulls herself back and gives him the opportunity, I suppose, to speak. So the two sat there for just a couple moments in silence. Finally, Jimmy decides to speak. And he says a phrase. He says something to the effect of, one thing I've learned in my life is that if you decide to act, you better be prepared to pay the price. And he stops. So she thinks about it for a moment, and she says to him, so you knew exactly what you were doing that day. You decided to act, and you were prepared to pay the price, giving up everything. And Jimmy thinks about it for a moment. He says, yes, absolutely. And she thinks about it, and she says to him, do you feel any remorse? Do you feel remorse for those 4 men that you killed that day? And Jimmy kind of shrugs it off, and he says, I feel remorse for a lot of things in my life. But truthfully, killing those 4 men, absolutely not. Not 1 ounce of remorse do I have for killing those men. And this hits her hard. She can't believe how frank and honest that Jimmy's actually being. And quite frankly, Jimmy is kind of surprised himself, because in his mind, he's thinking. He remembers the conversation he had with the warden, but and he knows that this is going to come at a big price to him. But again, Jimmy's the type of guy, he lives his life to a code. He was living to a code when he walked into the bar that day. He's living to a code right now by not pretending to be somebody he's not. He's not running a con. He's not running a scam. He's not trying to get an angle on anything. He wanted to go ahead and maybe possibly work with Pamela and, get inside the redemption, but he's not prepared to go ahead and say he's remorseful for killing those 4 men. And we're going to find out why. I think you probably already have a pretty good reason why. We know it has to do with those 4 men who were murdered the night before, the Shoeshine murders. So Pamela thinks about it for a moment. And finally, she just closes up her notebook and she says, Jimmy, I want to really thank you for your time and being so honest with me here today. But the series is called Redemption. You can't have redemption without any type of remorse. So she goes, well, you're truly an interesting character, and I would love to really get to know your story. But you're just not a good fit for my series. And Jimmy says, well, look, I appreciate you coming to see me. And she says, you're really not looking for redemption, are you? And Jimmy said, I never claimed that I was. He says, I know who I am. I am not looking to rewrite my history. I just want to go ahead and, finish my story. And she goes, well, Jimmy, I'd love to know more about your story. I think you're a fascinating man. I've done a lot of research on you. And while you might not be the best fit or the right fit for my series on redemption, I'd love to tell your story. And Jimmy just kind of laughs it off and says, my story? He says, that would take a lot more than just one visit here. And she goes, I've got all the time. I'll come back multiple times. She goes, I'd really like to get to know your story. From everything I know, after you killed those men, you just waited for the police. You put in a plea of guilty. You never gave any reason whatsoever why you killed those 4 men. You never tried to get a reduced sentence. You never put any evidence forward to justify, why you did it. You were front page news and everybody wanted to know, but you just sat in silence, didn't do anything. She goes, I'd love to be the one to tell your story, Jimmy. And Jimmy thinks about it for a little bit, and he says, well, I tell you what, I'd be willing to share my story with you because it's been long enough now. I think maybe I should. But I have a couple conditions. And he's thinking about the warden because he knows he's got to go ahead and he's got to navigate this thing in such a way to buy himself some time until he can figure out how he's going to handle the warden. If you remember, the warden's not going to be happy. The warden doesn't care about Jimmy telling his story, his life story, to Pamela Burns. He wants Jimmy to be, the poster boy, as Jimmy put it, for the Deerfield Correctional, to shed positive light on the prison, to put the warden in a positive light, so the warden can get a lot of good press coverage and use it in different PR releases and things like that to help him with his agenda, so to speak. So he's thinking, I gotta go ahead and I've got to buy myself some time. So he tells Pamela, okay, this is what I'm willing to do. I'm willing to give you an exclusive. I'm willing to tell you the complete untold story of my life, everything that's led me to sitting in front of you right here now today. But I've got two conditions. First, you've got to keep it quiet. For now, you don't tell the warden or any of the staff that primarily that what you're interviewing me about my story. You tell them that you're just conducting a series of interviews for me to be to consider me or to include me in your series on redemption. You don't have to, but for now, let's just buy some time. Next, before anything goes to print, I want to make sure that it's not going to hurt my family. I want to make sure that it's not going to hurt my sister or my niece. They're my two number one priorities. I don't care about myself. There's nothing that I can tell you or anybody else who was involved, because quite frankly, they're all gone. So I'm not worried about any of that, but I don't want to do anything that's going to go ahead and hurt my sister or my niece. So before anything goes to print, I want you to submit it, everything to my lawyer, Harold Gordon, and he's going to have final approval. If you can live with that, I'm willing to go ahead and give you an exclusive, tell you my entire story. She thinks for a moment, and she says, yeah, I can do that. So she says, okay, where do we begin? And she says, well, why not begin from the start? And he says, well, I can tell you the exact day. I know the exact day that changed my life forever. And she says, was it the day that you killed those 4 men? And Jimmy says, no. It was about 15 years before then. I was just a kid. And as he starts to go ahead and, think about it, in his mind, he starts to go back. He starts to go back to when he was just a child, when he was about 12, 13 years old. Because if you remember, he was I think 28 years old. Yeah, he was 28 years old when he killed those 4 men. So he goes back about 15 years to where he's about 12, 13 years old. And that's where the next chapter is going to pick up. The real story of the Shoeshine Boys, how everything evolves. So you don't want to miss next week. Next week is when the story really starts to come together. You're going to understand exactly how Jimmy actually went from shining shoes, that's why it's called the Shoeshine Boys, from shining shoes to actually running one of the most powerful crime organizations on the south side of Chicago. And it's going to start building on this, so you definitely don't want to miss next week. But that's going to wrap up this week's chapter. That's where it ends. Pamela, Jimmy, they get to know each other. They come to an agreement. She's going to go ahead and he's going to give her an exclusive. She's going to keep things quiet because, again, Jimmy's got to buy some time. He's got to figure out how he's going to handle the warden to keep him from, following through on those threats that he made about making things difficult for Jimmy's sister, to transferring Jimmy to Little Mexico, so he'd be basically sharing a cell with all the Crimson Kings and all the Hispanics who have a price on his head. Basically, killing Jimmy. Jimmy knows once he gets transferred over there and out of the protection of the Aryan Brotherhood, he's a dead man. But again, you're gonna learn a lot more about that. So stay tuned, keep coming back. Make sure you hit that notification button. Make sure that you subscribe. And again, please like, comments, and tell me, what you like, what you don't like. If you think of anything that I can do to improve the story, please put the comments in there. I read everything and I want to know. So, okay, till next week, thanks for coming. Stay focused and we'll see you soon.